Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Vivian A. and James L. Curtis Center for Health Equity Research and Training. My name is Daphne Watkins, and I'm the director of the Curtis Center, professor of social work, and a University Diversity and Social Transformation professor here at the University of Michigan. I am so thrilled to welcome you to our inaugural Health Equity Seminar Series presentation. Our inaugural speaker for the Curtis Center Health Equity Seminar Series is Dr. Tanya Sharpe from the University of Toronto. And in just a few moments, Dr. Jacqueline Hawkins will introduce our speaker. But before we do that, I want to begin by acknowledging the land that we are on. The University of Michigan was formed and has grown through connections with the land stewarded by the Three Fires people who are the Ojibwe, Odawa, Powhatan, along with their neighbors, the Seneca, Delaware, Shawnee, and Wyandot nations. Now, I would like to share a few housekeeping items with you before we begin our exciting talk. First, we have activated the live transcription feature of this Zoom webinar, so please turn this feature on if you would like closed captioning during the webinar. Second, we have disabled the chat to limit some distractions. And finally, should questions arise during the presentation, we ask that you place them in the Q&A box, and we're going to address them at the end of the presentation. So we're planning about a 40-minute presentation by Dr. Sharpe, followed by about 10 minutes, maybe 15, of Q&A. So now, without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic over to Dr. Jacqueline Hawkins, Assistant Professor of Social Work and Associate Director of the Curtis Center, who will introduce the speaker for today.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Watkins. My name is Jacqueline Hawkins, as was mentioned, and I would like to take a moment to introduce our amazing speaker today. So Dr. Tanya Sharpe is a community-based researcher who is committed to the development of innovative approaches and sustainable opportunities, allowing Black communities to thrive in the face of homicide violence. Her research examines sociocultural factors that influence the coping strategies of Black family members and friends of homicide victims. Dr. Sharpe has developed culturally appropriate interventions and best practices designed to assist African-American survivors of homicide victims in the management of their grief and bereavement. Her comprehensive model of coping for African-American survivors of homicide victims has informed the development of a psychosocial educational intervention and a tool of measurement designed to assess the needs and coping strategies of African-American survivors of homicide victims. And without further ado, I will give the stage to Dr. Sharpe.
Thank you so much, Dr. Watkins and Dr. Hawkins, for that warm welcome. And thank you to the Curtis Center for inviting me to share my research and thoughts about how we can further that research with you today. So without further ado, I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Ignore all the things that you see in the background there. I get teased all the time by my team about cleaning up that screen. So welcome, everyone. My name is Tanya Sharpe, and I'm an associate professor at the Factor and Winnetosh Faculty of Social Work at the University of Toronto. And for the past 20 years, I've been developing a program of research for and in collaboration with Black surviving family members and friends of homicide victims, a topic that has real-world implications to spaces and places throughout the globe: Chicago, Illinois, Johannesburg, South Africa, Kingston, Jamaica, Baltimore, Maryland, Toronto, Canada, and Detroit, Michigan. In short, no one is immune. But I'll circle back to that in a moment. Before I begin, I think it's important that you understand what drew me to this work, my calling, if you will. Before entering grad school, I was working at the Harvard School of Public Health, Division of Public Health Practice, working side by side with families and friends who were surviving the homicide of a loved one. I was working with them for the purpose of developing violence prevention programming. And it was during that time that I met Edna. And when I met Edna, well, Edna's son had just been murdered. A bunch of us who worked with Edna attended the funeral to pay our respects. I entered the church, and as I approached Edna, I extended my hand and said, "I'm so sorry for your loss." Edna looked at me with disdain and said, "I didn't lose my son. He was taken from me." Her words, they struck me. They struck me to my very core. And it was in that moment, that exact moment, that I knew I was called to do this work. In that moment, two things became abundantly clear. If I, as a trained social worker, even with the best of intentions, did not know how to comfort her, to help her, to support her, how equipped would other service providers be? The other thing I thought about was, how would Edna cope with the murder of her son? Now, Edna's story is not unlike the surviving mom whose son had just been murdered 1 month prior to my meeting her after delivering the keynote address at the inaugural Survivors of Homicide Victims Conference in Toronto, Canada. And all I could do was hold the space for her pain. A few years back, on a trip to Boston, I saw Edna again, and I ran over to her with excitement. I wanted to tell her that I kept my promise, that through my work, I'm uplifting the voices of so many who feel voiceless. That familiar weight of sadness clouded her eyes, and she grabbed my hand and said, "Tanya, I'm so glad, because my son Leonard, Edna's youngest son, was murdered last year. Time is running out," she said, "and we need you." So I'm very clear that the work that I do is in service to them. The survivors whose wounds are not visible to the naked eye, but in the absence of culturally responsive interventions, are left to fester and often never heal. Now, I want to provide some context relevant to homicide throughout our global community. On average, each year, 17,000 murders occur in the US. And what you'll hear many people say is that number's fairly low compared to other forms of violent crime. However, when you think about who the majority of homicide victims are, young Black men and women living in urban areas, when you realize that although African Americans make up 13% of the US population, and yet they account for more than half of homicide victims, and when you understand that on average, African Americans will experience the homicide of a loved one at least 2 times in their lifetime, you begin to realize that we are dealing with an epidemic that disproportionately impacts some of our most vulnerable. Now, this overrepresentation of Black homicide victims is not unique to the United States. On average, 600 murders occur in Canada each year. Out of the 13 provinces and territories, the number of homicide is often highest in Ontario. In 2019, Stats Canada released racialized data. Just from 2019, that indicated that racialized populations account for 75% of homicide victims in Ontario, 44% of whom identified as African, Caribbean, or Black. On average, in Jamaica, Jamaicans experience 1,500 murders each year, 9 times the global rate. In South Africans experience 18,000 murders each year, 7 times the global rate. Now, researchers Redmond and Doka suggest that each homicide victim has at least 7 to 10 family members who must now learn how to cope with their murders. However, the numbers alone don't allow for us to see that for Black people, our relationship to one another extends far beyond blood ties and country borders. So the ripple effect and impact of homicide is far reaching, suggesting that the number of family members and friends is greater than research predicts. In addition, when we consider the frequency in which homicide occurs in Black communities throughout the global diaspora, the United States, Canada, the Caribbean, Africa, Brazil, you begin to understand that we are dealing with a disproportionate number of Black people who are struggling to make sense out of that which is senseless. The numbers alone, devoid of both social and cultural context, contribute to gaps in research, policy, and practice, often allowing for false narratives to be made about the causes and consequences of experiencing the homicide of a loved one for Black communities, resulting in mistrust in formal institutions such as universities, the police, mental and medical health care services. Now, I want us to take a moment to really understand the disproportionate reality of homicide for Black people. Specifically, I want you to think about who Black survivors of homicide victims are. They are your clients, your peers, your students, our military, your child's coach, your mechanic, your colleagues, the pilot that offered a soft landing home from your last vacation, our grocery store clerks, our family, our children's friends. They are people you come in contact with every day who look just like me. They are your Ednas. They might even be you. So it is with this understanding of who they are and how we are all impacted, we are better positioned to not only understand the prevalence of cumulative Black death, we begin to comprehend the traumatic pandemic of grief that disproportionately devastates Black communities. With this understanding, we are better informed about ways we might support and intervene. Now, you may be thinking, as tragic as homicide is, I can't relate to the Black experience. Or perhaps you're thinking the subject matter is not related to your area of research. I want us to take a moment to think about that. Really think about that. When we consider the plethora of systems and services that survivors of homicide victims engage with on a daily basis, as well as the ones they need and interact with as a result of experiencing the murder of a loved one. Social work, medical and mental public health care systems, education, law, justice, criminology, and socio-legal services, public policy, technology, engineering, data science, faith-based institutions, global affairs, sociology. You begin to understand that you as teachers, researchers, policymakers, and developers for these professions, you play a pivotal role in what should and could be a global response to this unacknowledged and under-researched pandemic of grief. What we must also keep in mind is that Black people are not only grieving the pervasive murder of family members and friends on a global scale. But they are also experiencing collective trauma as a result of seeing the constant, brutal erasure of us over social media streams, played over and over and over again. This chronic exposure to cumulative Black death, wherein even if you are not related to the victim, you see yourself, you see your sons, you see your daughters, your brothers, and your sisters in these images. This collective trauma contributes to the grief of our humanity, our safety at pandemic proportions. And it does something to you. These individual and collective experiences of homicide lead to a ubiquity of injustice that complicates and disenfranchises Black people's ability to grieve. If by chance a murder is captured on video, we wait. We wait. We wait with bated breath for the perpetrators to be brought to trial and convicted, holding out for some shred of acknowledgement and recognition that we have the right to jog while Black, the right to drive while Black, order coffee while Black, talk on a cell phone while Black, enter your dorm room while Black, bird watch while Black, eat ice cream in your own home while Black, breathe while Black. We experience the ubiquity of injustice, not only in the collective viewing of our demise, or during trials where anti-Black racism is often the 13th juror, but also the manner in which reporting the prevalence of Black homicide is not acknowledged due to the lack of race-based data collection, as is the case in Canada, or when race-based data on homicide is available, absent from the discussion is the overrepresentation of Black homicides, particularly as it pertains to women. We've seen this in the recent reporting with the FBI homicide data, talking about the significant increase in 2020 in homicides. Significant for whom? And then until there was a public outcry, then there was some acknowledgement of the disproportionate impact on Black women in 2020. We have to do better. When we think about the systematic way anti-Black racism permeates the very fabric of our society, infecting like a relentless virus of violent inequity, those structures that Black people rely upon for their survival, we have a responsibility to take action. Now, I want to share with you some of the beginning of my work that led to the evolution of the Center for Research and Innovation for Black Survivors of Homicide Victims. How, in fact, I've gone about addressing the gaps in research. So, research on homicide focuses primarily still on the victim and the perpetrator. Research on African, Caribbean, and Black survivors of homicide victims is still very limited, relevant to their experiences as individuals, as a collective part of community, relevant to their coping strategies, relevant to their mental, the impact of chronic exposure of homicide, on their mental, physical, and spiritual well-being, and looking at service utilization patterns. Who are Black people going to for service? How often? What makes that service culturally responsive for Black survivors of homicide victims? And then creating culturally responsive programs and tools of measurement designed to best help them on their grief journey. So in the beginning, I asked the following research questions. What is the post-homicide experience of African-American survivors of homicide victims? What supports do they utilize? What are their grief responses? And certainly, how do they cope? Social cultural context was most paramount to this exploration, allowing me to conduct in-depth interviews, allowed me to hear the voices of African-American survivors of homicide victims, and listen to what they were saying about the influence of who they are, the obstacles that they face, and the impact of those experiences on coping with the homicide of a loved one. Through this process, I was able to better understand the social and cultural context that influences the manner in which African-American survivors of homicide victims experience the homicide of a loved one and identify resources to cope with it. Let me share a bit with you. Now, Alexander and Ho are researchers that describe the experience of being oppressed and marginalized and disenfranchised based upon one's racial and or ethnic status as cultural trauma. So under this domain of cultural trauma was this theme that came up in my interviews with African-American survivors of homicide victims of ancestral survivorship. I just have confidence in African-Americans' ability to be a people and understand from whence we came and understand how much baggage we've been able to destroy or clean up or whatever it is that we've had to deal with that I don't think we were born to bear. I believe the ability of my people to overcome so much, so many things and still have not truly, in my opinion, arrived at first-class recognition by many, many people. We are still, I think, some of the greatest achievers there are. This is Margaret, surviving grandparent, who, not unlike many survivors I've interviewed, really talked about this idea that due to ancestral survivorship in terms of surviving the atrocity of being enslaved, surely they should be able to survive the atrocity of surviving the murder of a loved one. Under the same domain of cultural trauma, anticipated hardship, I'm trying to make sure that you understand that one of the reasons for me, and I dare say the majority of African Americans and people of color, the reason we keep things to ourselves is life is supposed to have a little bit of pain. You know, no sunshine without the rain. We grew up with those kind of anecdotes that make us hold things in. This is Elaine, a surviving aunt. I want you all to keep your eye on Elaine. We'll circle back to her in a moment, but keep your eye and ear on Elaine. So Elaine is really saying here that because of anti-Black racism, because our ancestors and have endured so much, that we anticipate that we're going to be followed in the mall. We anticipate that the color of our skin will be viewed as a deadly weapon. This is why we see Black parents having talks with their children about what do you do when you're pulled over by the police. You say, yes, ma'am, yes, sir. You put your hands on the steering wheel. You don't make any sudden movements. We anticipate that we will endure harm and discrimination. So what's important to note here is that what survivors were sharing with me is that before they even experience the homicide, that they experience cultural trauma as a result of anti-Black racism. Racism is trauma. And then a homicide occurs. And what survivors were telling me is that they enter into a culture that is altogether unique, where there were certain themes that were part of this culture of homicide. Shame, stigma. I try to cope now by not being ashamed to talk about it, because I was ashamed to talk about it, especially being African American, and the stereotypes of African Americans, that we are just prone to this. And like every time I tell people this, not every time, I'm exaggerating now a bit here, but someone says, oh, is it drug related? Like that is the first thing that pops out of their mouths. This is Malik, a surviving cousin, who talked about the interaction with many, many people, making assumptions of the murder of his cousin being gang related, drug related, etc. And I hear this quite frequently from other survivors I've interviewed. Blame. I question whether or not there was something I could have done to keep him out of that environment. And therefore, perhaps this never would have occurred. So I guess I'm saying, in some sense, I'm always questioning whether or not I'm partially or a bit somehow responsible for his tragic death. This is Elaine, a surviving aunt whose nephew used to come up every summer to visit. The one summer he didn't was the summer he was shot and killed. Lack of justice. I remember my brother was like, we all know who did it, and the problem is the police aren't doing anything about it. My brother was like, I know who it is, we all know who it is, because my cousin was apparently not the right target. It is unsolved, and we just feel like they, meaning the police, don't care. This is Malik, a surviving cousin. Over and over again from survivors, I hear this theme of lack of justice. If police take too long to arrive to the scene, if the murder remains unsolved and there's no communication between law enforcement and surviving family members. So what became clear to me is that the culture of trauma and the culture of homicide, there was something going on between these two constructs. And the work of Lazarus and Folkman helped to explain some of what was happening here. A stressor, homicide happens and occurs, and there's something else that takes place. There's an appraisal. But for African-American survivors of homicide victims, there seemed to be something different than simply appraising the stressor of homicide. My friend and colleague, Dr. Sean McGuffey, talks about this construct, racial appraisal, indicating that contrary to Lazarus and Folkman, who talk about stress and coping, that you identify a stressor and you appraise that stressor to see whether I'm going to use emotion-focused coping, I'm going to cry, or problem-focused coping. I'm going to figure out how to pay for the funeral. There was something else happening for African-American survivors of homicide victims. And we call it racial appraisal. Racial appraisal suggests that for Black people, disenfranchised populations, racial appraisal consists of both culture and structure. Culture is a set of shared attitudes and beliefs about the way things should be done. And it is crucial to how people perceive and cope with trauma. Structure shapes those perceptions in that it dictates the distribution of resources. Race is a component of our social structure that allocates materials, goods, and services, social and psychological resources unevenly throughout the United States. Racialized populations like African Americans appraise stressful encounters and assess coping resources based upon this paradigm. I'm going to assess, is that clinician going to further stigmatize me? I'm going to assess, are you there to hurt me, help me, or support me, and how? So when we consider cultural trauma and the interaction with the culture of homicide and the racial appraisal, these constructs and the appraisal, the racial appraisal, influence coping strategies that African-American survivors of homicide victims shared with me. Spiritual coping. My grandmother used to say, if you have a problem, take it to God. She didn't say take it to the therapist. This is Elaine, surviving aunt. I believe in God, meaning making. I believe in God, but to a certain extent, because I don't think God takes an innocent baby or a person that good that wants to help the world. So I keep telling myself, he probably needs another angel out, and then probably needed another angel now. Over and over again, this is Langston, an 18-year-old surviving cousin, in my interaction with survivors who lean on faith-based tools to make sense out of the murder. You hear the explanation, searching for an explanation through their faith. Maintaining a connection to the deceased. I try to cope with it by maintaining a personal connection with him, meaning like having conversations with him, suggesting when things get difficult, or remembering that I don't want anybody else to have to deal with the kind of things I did. So almost talking to him or praying to him to get through not only the grief that I feel regarding his loss, but also to get through and do the work that I need to do. This is Trinity, a surviving cousin who actually is a social worker, who talked about maintaining connection to her cousin who was murdered, but really trying to figure out how to cope with it so that she could help other survivors of homicide victims. Collective coping and caring. I really focused on what my family was going through rather than what I was going through. I was really like, what do you need? How do we get this together? So in many ways, that was my coping mechanism, by not dealing with it in many respects. So I focused my energies on helping other people. Now, Elaine Pinderhughes, Nancy Boyd Franklin, so many researchers have documented how African-American families rely heavily on this collective coping. They rely on the family members to cope with all types of stressors. What was a consistent finding with African-American survivors of homicide victims is there were typically one or two individuals in the family that were caring for everyone else. So the question remains, who's caring for those individuals? This is where we hear this construct or this discussion about resilience, but at some point the bow breaks if we have exorbitant rates and prevalence of homicide and the trauma of anti-Black racism. And there are typically one or two individuals in the family caring for the rest. What happens to them? How are they supported? Concealment. I think I tend to internalize and find a small part of my heart or a small part of my mind, an actual small closet in my heart or small closet in my mind to shut up those things that bother me. I don't know if you remember the movie The Godfather. There's a line in The Godfather where Michael says to his younger brother, you never speak against family. You never disagree with the family. You never go outside the family. And I think that is kind of my mantra. I'm just not of the belief that you go outside of the home to garner assistance for family or personal problems. This is Elaine, a surviving aunt. I told you to keep your eye on Elaine. Elaine, when I interviewed her, smoked 2 packs of cigarettes a day, had diabetes and high blood pressure. She is not unlike many survivors I've interviewed who describe feeling pain where their son was shot, or being diagnosed or experiencing a stroke shortly after their second, third child was murdered. There is a fundamental unexplored correlation between the constant erasure, the constant trauma, the pandemic of grief, and its impact on health outcomes. So, as a result of listening to the voices of African-American survivors of homicide victims, I was able to develop the first model of coping specifically designed to speak to their experiences of coping, wherein African-Americans describe that before they wake up, before they even get out of bed, they're very keenly aware that they will experience, and they have experienced, cultural trauma as a result of anti-Black racism. Then a homicide happens and they enter into a culture that is altogether unique, where shame, blame, stigma, and lack of justice are most paramount. And these two constructs work together to influence the coping strategies. And African Americans appraise the stressor of homicide through a race-based lens and that appraisal will then influence the coping strategies that they identify. So when we think about this, what are the implications for research, policy, and practice? Well, what became clear to me is that by listening to the voices of African-American survivors of homicide victims, working with them collectively to create culturally responsive interventions was part of our response. So research has to be done for and with community. And I'll share some of the projects we've been able to do with that same framework in mind. Tools of measurement that capture both the experience of anti-Black racism and the experience of chronic exposure to homicide must be created to fully capture what resources are needed, but also how individuals are going about coping. Exploring the experiences of Black survivors of homicide victims throughout the diaspora was most paramount. Black people are not a monolith. So research must be able to look at the differences within African and Caribbean and Black communities on coping and how they go about supporting one another. Policy, it was very clear out of these conversations that we must begin to collect race-based data, but homicide race-based data. We must begin to collect it consistently and then amplify that. Amplify the patterns of inequity that we are seeing across communities and across countries. I think what also became clear is that we're missing some important opportunities to really understand the victim and perpetrator overlap, begin to understand survivors of homicide victims by capturing trauma histories. I don't know if you all remember in the very beginning stages of the intimate partner violence movement, if you will, one of the projects or one of the strategies for intervening and supporting individuals who are victims of intimate partner violence was training physicians to be able to capture trauma histories when parents and caregivers brought their children in for wellness checks. It's with that same innovation that we can begin to create trauma history assessments, but train individuals who are who run barbershops, who are hairstylists, who come in contact with Black survivors of homicide victims every day to be able to capture these histories so that we can be better positioned to respond. So that I'm not getting a call from the school that's saying, I don't know what's happening to this child. He's been identified with attention deficit disorder. And when we peel back the layer of that onion, we discover, 6 months ago, when he was walking to the corner store, he witnessed the murder of his uncle. Practice, programming and interventions must be culturally responsive. In order to be culturally responsive, we have to, again, begin to partner with individuals with lived experience. Training, with this understanding, with this framework, with some of the tools of measurement, we have a responsibility to begin to train clinicians and other service providers, all of the service providers and the emerging scholars that I mentioned that come in contact with survivors of homicide victims on how to best position themselves to be culturally responsive in their delivery of service. The absence of acknowledging chronic and cumulative Black death, it obstructs our ability to comprehend and respond appropriately to the traumatic impact homicide has on family members and friends of homicide victims. Moreover, neglecting to acknowledge the chronic overrepresentation of Black homicide victims is yet another form of victimization. Truly valuing Black lives requires engagement and thorough assessment and candid conversations about the root causes and consequences of homicide for Black communities. the Center for Research and Innovation for Black Survivors of Homicide Victims, the CRIB, was established so that we can respond to these formative risks through the advancement of culturally responsive research, policy, and practice designed to meet the unmet needs of Black survivors of homicide victims. Our vision is to develop culturally responsive approaches for Black survivors of homicide victims throughout our global communities. Our mission is to reduce service inequities for and with Black survivors of homicide victims, again, for the purpose of developing culturally responsive research, policy, and practice. Our values are rooted in equity from the community with the community, embrace and drive change, create sustainable opportunities for communities, cultural humility, passion and determination, and adopting culturally responsive approaches in everything that we do. I would be remiss if I didn't give my amazing team, who every day uplifts the voices of Black survivors of homicide victims. And of course, our faculty affiliates, who aren't just scholars across disciplines at U of T, but they're scholars throughout the US as well, across disciplines, who see themselves in this work. They're also individuals who are doing boots on the ground work, community engaged folk that have come together with an interdisciplinary network of scholars for the purpose of responding to the needs of Black survivors of homicide victims. The CRIB's current funding streams consist of funding from the University of Toronto's Provost Office and the Division of University Advancement, a SHIRK Insight Grant, which is our federal funding stream here in Canada, the Ontario Racism Directorate, the US Department of Justice, and the University of Maryland School of Social Work. Now, as a result of some of this successful funding, we've been able to create some innovative programming that begins to address some of those unmet needs. During the pandemic, and I don't know if I've mentioned this, but the CRIB is, I think, almost 3 years old. In March will be 3. We launched our website in the middle of the pandemic, and the entire team pulled their heads together to come up with this idea of making sure that our presence could be felt throughout social media platforms. So we came up with an Instagram live show called 30 at 8:30, where every Wednesday night, we bring together a collective of interdisciplinary scholars and community folk doing the work to hold the space for just 30 minutes to talk about the structural inequities that are inherently structurally violent and that disproportionately impact some of our most vulnerable. I have partnered with a colleague of mine from Fordham University who created the first police encounters survey. Out of that survey that was disseminated to 4 US cities, we were able to produce 7 manuscripts that really talked about the impact of police encounters on mental and physical and spiritual well-being. The Survivors of Homicide Victims and Mental Health Project, a collaboration with the Canadian Mental Health Association funded by the Anti-Racism Directorate, where for the first time, we were listening to the voices of Indigenous, African, Caribbean, and Black, and racialized survivors of homicide victims and their service providers for the purpose of understanding what's hurtful and helpful. As a result of this collaboration, we were able to create a post-homicide pedagogy that will inform a training that we're in the process of developing. And we disseminated that our preliminary findings to over 181 service providers across the province. In addition to that collaboration with both service providers and Indigenous, African, Caribbean, Black, and racialized survivors, we were able to develop 10 policy recommendations designed to enhance the delivery of services for survivors of homicide victims. The inventory of coping for African American survivors of homicide victims. From that model of coping that I just shared with you, I was able to develop an inventory of coping that will be useful for clinicians and service providers to be able to assess what are the coping strategies that are utilized by African American survivors of homicide victims with a fundamental understanding that they have experienced several traumas that influence those coping strategies. The repeat exposure and experience of trauma as a result of anti-Black racism, and the pervasive and chronic exposure to homicide in this pandemic of grief. The Invisible Wounds Project, funded by the Sharpe Insight Grant, which is the first project of its kind, again, listening to the voices of African, Caribbean, and Black survivors of homicide victims in Toronto, Canada, for the purpose of developing culturally responsive interventions. Now, we started some of this work, but there's still so much more to do. Our pathway forward requires us to understand that our response to the pandemic of grief must be as vast as its impact. Therefore, we must consider how we might harness our collective intellect across disciplines and countries, how victims' services can create policy that's more culturally responsive to the experiences of African Americans. And what I mean by that is, it should not be the case if we consider that African Americans have aunties and uncles that aren't necessarily related by blood. Who has access and support to resources to bury a loved one, to visit to claim the deceased body? We have to think about how we're being more culturally responsive in our victim services in terms of definition of family and so many other things. Look at the impact of COVID in particular. We have yet to see the impact of COVID and grief on the mental, physical, and spiritual well-being of Black communities, particularly when we consider social distancing protocols. If we know that Black people traditionally rely upon one another, that collective coping during COVID, and we know homicides have increased, right? We have family members who repeatedly are saying to me, I had to make decisions about the 10 people that could attend my son, my daughter's funeral. What happens in the aftermath as they try to navigate their grief journey in isolation? We have yet to see the impact of this, and we must begin to research these findings. We have to look at a pathway forward, really has to come by recognizing that Black people are grieving in insurmountable ways. But how is that expression of grief taking place during COVID? What and how are individuals creating community to hold the space for them? We have to examine how social media platforms have been utilized, how other pathways for supporting one another have been created. I also think we have the responsibility to look at what does grieving look like, grieving and coping. What are the differences between individuals who have experienced the murder of a loved one and their murder is solved versus unsolved? I also think we have to begin to look at homicide typology. What are the differences with grief and coping when we think about a loved one that's killed by the police, state-sanctioned police violence, a stranger, family member, etc. These are just some of the future initiatives that we have a responsibility to begin to engage in order to address the structural inequities. My dear colleagues, the impact of COVID has taught us many things, one of which is that we are inherently reliant upon one another for our survival. It is through this same framework that I ask you to consider the fact that we are stronger together than we are apart. Together, we have the opportunity to maximize our greatest potential, to not simply help Black people survive the pandemic of grief as a result of homicide and the ubiquity of injustice, but perhaps thrive thereafter. I look forward to the possibilities. Their lives are depending on it. Thank you.
Dr. Sharpe. Wow. You never cease to amaze and to just, wow, talk about bated breath. Well, we'll have a sidebar about so many things, but for the purposes of this webinar, I'd like to field some questions now so we can try to stay within time. So there were a few questions that came through, and I'll let you take a sip of water, so I'll go slowly when I begin asking this question. But one question that came through was, can you speak to the differences between the United States and Canada around collecting and reporting race-based data? So you talked a little bit about your work in Baltimore, and now, of course, you're in Toronto. So can you just say a little bit about what the experiences are like between the two places?
Can I? And I'll try to make my response fairly brief. Yeah, if I'm quite honest, let me. I remember in 2018 preparing for my job talk here at U of T, and doing my due diligence in terms of looking for the data that really spoke to the disproportionate reality for African, Caribbean, and Black folks, Indigenous folks, and the data wasn't there. And so I immediately thought, clearly I'm missing something. So I called colleagues at public health, I called colleagues at social work, I called colleagues at epidemiology, and then they said, no, Tanya, actually, we don't collect data by race here. And, the reality is this: even though there has been a push, particularly in the last 2 years, when I think about the work being done with Toronto Police Services to mandate that they collect data by race, Canada still has a long way to go. And the reality is, anecdotally, and the work that I'm doing with community members here, we're seeing the increase. StatsCan collects data for Indigenous and murder victims, but they do not collect data for African, Caribbean, and Black people. And as I mentioned in my talk, that is a pretty significant oversight. If you don't count it, it doesn't count. And that dictates resources and services that African, Caribbean, and Black people don't have access to, particularly if we know there's been a significant increase in homicides in Canada, and they're coming from countries that experience disproportionate homicides, and they have family members in the US. You're having a multitude of communities who do not have access to culturally responsive care. So that's problematic. But I also would be remiss if I didn't say I was, I don't know if I should use this strong word, but I will, a bit incensed at the lack of response in the US with this recent reporting of the increase in homicides, not talking about the pandemic of grief or the disproportionate reality for Black people. It's not really an increase. We've been living in this traumatic, chronic exposure to homicide, and folks miss the mark, I think, really to talk about that. But hopefully, I'll be able to address that later. But yeah, those are some of the major differences I'm seeing.
Yes, if we don't count it, it doesn't count. I feel like that needs to be a hashtag somewhere. Those of you live tweeting, let's hashtag that. Okay, so let me see. We should have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. So let's see which one. So how about this one? This is an interesting one. What impact do the public broadcasting of legal trials have on the families of victims whose loved ones may not have such public attention on the death of their loved one? So I think this person's asking, when we see the trials that we've seen just in the past few weeks, do you have a sense for what some of the families left behind are experiencing whose family members may not have had such a public presence?
Thank you so much for the question. Grief is complex. And this is why capturing social cultural factors is so important. And it is challenging. Just I can say anecdotally, I haven't done a thorough investigation and examination, but it is challenging for those who have loved ones whose murders appear on Section D of our newspapers or weren't caught on camera. But there's also the complexity of, wow, in order for us to even have a chance at justice, we have to have someone videotape our demise. So there are all kinds of responses and angles, I think, that people take with this. I think that yes, there is a certain amount of heartache and challenge, and I think it impacts the grief process for individuals who, whose loved ones are not uplifted every day. But this is also why you see, again, maintaining a connection to the deceased. You see decals, you see tattoos, because I don't ever want you to forget that my loved one's life mattered. So I think that the disappointment or the challenge and its impact on grief is expressed in very, very different ways, depending upon where you position yourselves. On the opposite side of the spectrum, I think people who do, have their loved ones murdered, their loved ones murder in the media, they're inundated. They're inundated constantly with media and exposure, and that also impacts the grief process as well. So these ruptures and this disruption doesn't occur from within, it's also influenced from the outside. And I think that's that would be a great actually study to be able to look at those differences. So thank you for that question. Write that down.
All right, so I'm going to take full advantage of the last 3 minutes and ask this one more question that came through. And I realize the answer may take longer than 3 minutes, but we're going to go for it anyway, because we don't often have an opportunity to connect in this way and to really learn about the great work that you and your team at the Crib are doing. So this one is a complicated question. I definitely feel the person who shared this question, because this is complicated. What are the specific needs of survivors? And do you find that that there are variations across their needs based on their relationship to the victim, right? Like you reported on conversations you've had with aunts and cousins and things like that. And it's just, do you see variations across what their needs are as someone who does not only the research and the policy, but the practice work with survivors?
Wow, thank you for the question. And absolutely. One of the things that I think that I talked about in the last slide, or maybe I skipped over it, was we have to look at the sort of the demographic differences with the expression of grief. And I'll never forget, very early on in my career, that became very clear in terms of the differences and the services that are required. And I'll give 2 examples specifically. When I think about sibling survivors of homicide victims, I remember a sibling distinctly describing to me their concealment of their expression of grief, because they were very, very keenly concerned about their parents. And they saw, right? They saw the grief that their parents were going through. So they wanted to shield them from further harm. Imagine a 12-year-old, 13-year-old, right? So this is where you see, again, also age-wise, right? But also that dynamic, that they were relying on peers, or they were internalizing, right? Just concealing and internalizing their pain. So there's a unique, I think, set of circumstances and set of space that needs to be created for sibling survivors to that, in that sense, right? They have to have their own space away from other family members to express their pain. I also noticed this particularly in the work that I did in Baltimore with survivors of homicide victims, the majority of whom were women, but there were 3 men that attended one of those groups. And it was very clear to me, same dynamic. They didn't want to show their partner or their spouse their vulnerability. They wanted to try to be strong, but they were in so much pain. And so the expression and the socialization of grief for men, that needs to be held. That needs to have the freedom to breathe in a very sacred space, in a very specific way. Some of the work that I've done with Safe Streets as well in Baltimore, same kind of thing. So yes, there are different ways of expressing grief depending upon our social norms and values and customs, and we have to figure out how to deliver services that way that are appropriate.
Yes. Well, Dr. Sharpe, I can't believe we're at the end of this hour, but wow, it's just been so insightful to hear about your work. So thanks for everyone who attended. Thanks everybody on the line. Dr. Sharpe, the University of Toronto, founding director of the Crib. So you can definitely find her information online. Dr. Sharpe, founding director of the Crib. Thank you so very much for your time today. And thank you for being the inaugural speaker for the Curtis Center for Health Equity Research and Training's Health Equity Seminar Series.
My honor, my privilege. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.